It has been a special past 2 days in the context of human extinction level events and actions or situations that have contributed to that. One of them being we are currently, today is actually the peak of us passing through the Leonid meteor stream. And I think NASA reported it was about 15 meteors per hour that we're able to see in clear skies, which is pretty significant as far as our existence on Earth. So today's a special day. There's also something that happened it was either today or yesterday in context to some of the wars going on in the world, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about human extinction events and the ones that pose threats to us currently. So without further ado, Randall, let's jump into it. What's going on around us today? What's going on in the cosmos that poses a threat to us humans?
Oh, well, there are both natural threats and human-caused threats. Let's deal with natural threats first. Now, like you said, we are going through, right today, November 17th. It takes us 4 or 5 days really to cross through the Leonid meteor stream. But today and tomorrow's, you could consider the peak of the intersection between the Earth's orbit and the orbit of the Leonid meteor stream. Now, I think most of the viewers and listeners know that meteor streams ultimately are descendants of comets. And comets will come into the inner solar system through various mechanisms, gravitationally, for the most part. And when they do that, they begin to disintegrate. And in the process of disintegration, they produce meteor streams.
Right.
And there are essentially two types of comets that we could talk about based upon their orbits. We have the shorter period comets, which may be between a few years and a couple of hundred years. And then we have these longer period comets, and they're distinguished by the geometry of their orbits. So, an ellipse is like a flattened circle, right? And all orbital processes that we see in the solar system are elliptical. Some of them are very close to being circular, and a circle can be thought of as a special case of an ellipse. But with an ellipse, think of a circle, and you flatten the ellipse. And the more you flatten the ellipse, the greater the eccentricity. So you have the major axis that's along the long that's the long axis, and then the short axis is the minor axis. So, and then you have focal points. You have two focal points, and the thing is an elliptical orbit. The sum of the distances to one of the focal points anywhere in that orbit is going to be the same. So, in other words, think of a focal. I should have prepared a little graphic here, but I will be diving into this in an upcoming Squaring the Circle podcast, where I kind of get into the geometry of it. So I guess I don't need to do it here, other than to say that as the object, in this case, we're talking about a comet nucleus, which was the originator of the Leonid meteor stream. If you take it at any 2 points in its orbit, and you're all aligned to one of the focal points, and to any other point in the orbit, the sum of those two are going to always be the same. It's an interesting property of an ellipse. It's hard to explain. It's much easier to demonstrate and show with some graphics. So I will be doing that on my Squaring the Circle podcast. Now, the comet from which the Leonid meteors are derived is called Tempel-Tuttle. And Tempel and Tuttle were two astronomers who both are given credit with discovering the comet. It was the mid-1800s. I forgot the exact year. And then it was lost for a while, and then it was rediscovered.
Yeah, I think it was 65 and 66, like two independent discoveries of the same comet.
That sounds about right. Mid 1800s, exactly. So, so the Leonids have a period close to that of Temple Tuttle, which is about 33 years, which is its orbital period. And I have a graphic here. Let me pull up this graphic that'll help.
And while you're pulling up that graphic, I was looking into Leonid, the Leonid meteor stream, and everybody who writes about Leonids writes about it more from the idea of it's this amazing phenomena that we get to witness. It's this beautiful thing that happens in the sky. And nobody really looks at it as a threat to humanity. That maybe it's because of the orbit, it's not actually going to come close to us or hit us, or the fact that the meteors are most of the time grains of sand disintegrating
Yes,
in our atmosphere. Is that true? Is there any threat from the Leonid meteor stream?
I think that there's always the potential of a threat. I mean, within the meteor stream, there's probably objects that are substantial enough to cause some destruction. But they're going to be relatively rare. I don't think that the Leonid stream, although there are some traditions, I was going to pull one up for this meeting, but it got away from me. But there are traditions about past catastrophes associated with, by the nature of the stories. For example, one of them talks about a great destruction that occurred when fire poured out of the constellation of Leo. And to me, that would be a clear reference to probably the encounter with a bolide or several of them out within the Leonid meteor stream that would have caused regional destruction, but maybe not global destruction. The ones that seem to be the most prevalent in terms of the threat to Earth would be, I think that the number one is the Torrid stream, and I think that there's a considerable body of evidence to suggest that Earth's encounters with the Torrid meteor stream have produced very substantial catastrophes. In fact, Bill Napier, the English astronomer, has proposed that the most likely candidate for Younger Dryas boundary impacts is Torrid encounters with the Torrid meteor stream. I also think that the Draconid meteor stream has probably produced some pretty significant, at least regional catastrophes. Maybe not global catastrophes, but I mean to talk about a global catastrophe. Once you're getting, say, in the half-mile to mile diameter range of the object, now we're talking about global consequences. And you have to realize that you're going to have, in an impact type event, very much like a major volcanic event, you're going to have the immediate consequences of the event. You're going to have, let's say, a half a diameter bolide. Let's say, well, a comet nucleus typically, in the case of one like, let's say, Halley, it's about 10 miles in diameter. And the likelihood of an impact of a comet nucleus is considerably less than the impact of an asteroid. Okay, it's probably in the ratio of 10 to 1, something like that.
Why is that?
Well, just because it seems like there's a lot more asteroidal material circling the sun that the Earth potentially could encounter. Now, some of that material may be ultimately derived from the disintegration of a comet nucleus. What I've noticed over the years of studying the literature between comets and asteroids is that they're not as distinct of two distinct families as previously assumed. There's a lot of overlap. And in fact, there's quite a number of asteroids that display activity that makes them look more like a comet nucleus. And then there are comet nuclei that, or material associated with a comet that looks more asteroidal than cometary. So it could be that some of the things that we think are asteroids are the byproducts of the disintegration of a comet nucleus. Now, let me see if I can find something here to show you ever since we had close-ups of Comet Halley, we've had here we go. So let me share this. This is what's called a Halley type, let's see, screen. There we go. Halley type nucleus. Let's see, we're on StreamYard, so this is a little bit different. Okay, here we go. Good. Okay. Easy enough. I guess we're seeing this, aren't we?
Yeah, we're seeing it.
Okay, so here you've got a Halley-type comet nucleus. Now, the long axis of this object is about somewhere between 8 and 10 miles, if I remember right. And that's going to be a medium-sized comet nucleus. A very big one, and something we're not going to really talk about in this discussion tonight is the giant comet hypothesis, which theorizes or hypothesizes that at some point, let's say between 25 and 30,000 years ago, a very large comet came into the inner solar system and began to undergo a hierarchy of disintegrations, and it may have been 50, 60 miles in diameter or bigger. And it would have been this comet that spawned the Torrid meteor stream, plus a couple of what appear to be asteroids, old Giotto, if you want to pull that up, and that's probably a member of that family, OLJATO, I believe. So when we look at the next slide, here's to me where it gets interesting, is now, if we're going to, the next slide, we're going to do a cross-section of the nucleus. Now you'll notice here these discharges of volatile materials. That's one of the things that would clearly differentiate a comet nucleus from an asteroid. Mm-hmm. is the presence of volatiles within within the comet. And in this case, the comet it's a very heterogeneous mix of stuff that's sort of held together by this crust. There's actually a crust on the comet nucleus that holds the whole thing together. And then once it comes in, like if it makes close passage by the sun or the Earth or Jupiter, any other cosmic object, that can activate the volatile materials, but particularly when it's coming into the sun and heats up, that begins to activate the volatile materials, and you start getting this outgassing. And it's this outgassing that when you see a comet that's got the long tail, that's the ionized gas that's being generated from and it's different. You have to differentiate between the tail and the trail. Mm-hmm. The trail is the macroscopic debris, or could be microscopic, but it's the stuff that would actually produce meteors. It's detectable by eye. It's under the microscope. You can actually see, like you said earlier, some meteors that we see, shooting stars, are not much more than grains of sand. But that's material as part of the trail. So now the trail is going to be left essentially in the wake. Just like if you imagine a truck loaded up with stuff barreling down the highway, the stuff flying out is going to essentially be like like a tail, but it's not called a tail. It's called a trail. The tail is ionized gas, and it is not going to necessarily follow in the lee of the comet nucleus. It's going to point away from the sun, because its position in space is actually being determined by the solar wind. So if you look at photos of comets, you'll see that as comets are moving around the sun, the tail is always pointing away from the sun, which is interesting.
That is.
But the trail is different. The trail is the stuff, the solid stuff, coming off of the disintegrating comet. And of course, it's that stuff that Earth would encounter that could cause, a meteor storm, which Leonids in the past were pretty spectacular, as I will show you here. But look at the next slide. When we take a cross-section of this, now, as you're looking at this, what you want to do is you want to think about, okay, so what happens when a comet nucleus begins to disintegrate? Well, you can see what it does. It's carrying all of this cargo, if you will, within this icy matrix. And when it disintegrates, this is the stuff that gets dumped into the orbit. Essentially, the meteor streams will more or less follow the orbit of the progenitor comet, but not necessarily, because again, the devolatilization can cause like successive generations of disintegration. That's what I talked about when I refer to a hierarchy of disintegrations. So, like right now, the Torrids, there's several Torrid streams that are very closely related, but they're distinct in their own way. And that's probably because the original object broke, came apart, and then you had two subsequent pieces moving close in space, and then they both disintegrated and created almost like sibling meteor streams.
I see.
We see that we see that in the case of the Torrids. But now you can imagine if this is 10 miles long, it disintegrates. Potentially, what could be produced in here is millions of Tunguska type objects, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how many times over the last, let's say, 10,000 years have we on Earth been hit by something that obviously it wasn't a global, maybe it was globally catastrophic, but how many times have we been hit by something significant?
Well, I've seen estimates up to 500 times in the Holocene. Now, most of those would be local or regionally destructive. But if we start talking about, once we get to the level of Tunguska, we're talking a major event there. I mean, anytime you're talking about an explosion in the atmosphere of 15 million tons of TNT, you're talking about a significant event.
Right.
And Tunguska's, would be a smaller event. And so I think we can show that there have been perhaps 3 encounters during the 20th century, including if we accept, and it's a pretty well-determined case that in, I think it was 1933, there was 3 objects that struck the Brazilian rainforest. And I believe I talked about that in a recent
I'm not familiar with this. 3 objects, and you said 1933?
Look up Brazilian impacts. See what it brings up. I think you'll find some stuff, references to it. You definitely will if you use Google Scholar for a search engine.
Yeah, I'm looking.
Okay, let's see here.
So, give us a brief description of that. I'm looking while I'm pulling this up. So 1908 was Tunguska, I believe.
Yes.
I have that date right. And then 1933, it sounds like there was something that happened in Brazil. You said there was 3 that happened in the 20th century. Was there one following that?
Yes, yes, there's, in fact, it could be more than 3, but when the most well-documented is Tunguska. We know that happened.
Mm-hmm.
The Brazilian event is also well-documented, but we don't have a lot of eyewitness accounts. But we do have, an account about, I think he was a Catholic priest who heard about it, went into the villages and stuff and collected a bunch of eyewitness testimony. And it's not as well established as Tunguska. Tunguska is much better known, and it was probably maybe a quarter to a half the devastation of Tunguska, but it caused local firestorms. Let's see here. I'm sure that I did talk about it in one of my apocalypse series in Squaring the Circle.
Yeah. We'll link that. We'll link that in the comments and description here so people can check that out. What we're talking about is in the last 100 years, just to make this relatable, over the last 100 years, potentially even sooner than that, Earth has been struck by probably sub-kilometer objects, but significant sized objects that cause spontaneous fires. And in Tunguska, in the case of Tunguska, caused significant damage. What was it? It was between it was megatons,
It,
megatons of power.
15 megatons are it's ranged from 10 up to 50 that I've seen, but most of the estimates place it in the range of about 15 megatons, which is useful because the largest hydrogen bombs tested by the U.S. were roughly 15 megatons.
Wow. Yeah.
And when you watch some of the videos that have been declassified, and I believe it's Mike, it's 15 megatons is a massive explosion. In fact, there's an artist's depiction of a 15 megaton explosion over a major city. Let's just take a quick look at that so people can get a sense of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Share screen.
I think you're already sharing.
Window. Okay. How about this?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. So that would give you a sense of the scale of, here's a major urban area, and this would be what's unleashed. Now, of course, what's happening is this shock front that's moving outwards is going to pretty much destroy everything within this field of view.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, this kind of gives you a sense of the scope or scale of a 15 megaton explosion.
Yeah. So we're sitting in a world where we got the most powerful hydrogen bombs flying past us, and a lot of the time people are looking up at the sky being like, wow, look how pretty that is. That's amazing. What do we do as human beings? Can we do anything about this? Can we protect ourselves from objects in space that could potentially destroy us, or at least set us back 50 to 100 years?
The answer to that is potentially yes, we could. Now, a Tunguska event is not a planet killer. It's not going to destroy civilization. It's going to, the area that was drastically affected by the Tunguska event is roughly 800 to 850 square miles. Now, to put that into perspective, if you look at a major urban area, like Atlanta, for example, has Perimeter Highway 285. The area inside 285 of the Perimeter Highway, and I've looked at several other, like Denver, Washington, D.C., in the same scale, is about 800 to 900 square miles. So in other words, a Tunguska event over a major, let's say over an urban center, could wipe out any city on Earth, at least out to a range of about 20 miles from the epicenter of the explosion. So yeah, I mean, that's the thing. And what we're really, though, considering here, now think back to the image I just showed you, the cross section of a hypothetical comet nucleus. You see, if we talk about an event, say in the category of the dinosaur killer, that was most likely one huge impact and a number of smaller ones. It looks like there was some clustered bombardment around the Cretaceous-Tertiary boundary. But the big one that left the buried crater in the Yucatan, right in your backyard, about 6 miles in diameter, was the estimate of that size. And that's based upon the amount of iridium that would have been injected into the atmosphere, because asteroids are enriched in iridium compared to the rocks of the Earth's crust. So if you find a layer of iridium, that's an anomalous event that happened there. Something had to introduce that. And when the scientists first discovered taking a closer look at the KT boundary to see what was in it, they discovered this enormous iridium spike. So subsequent to that original discovery, which was in Italy, the colleagues in Denmark and New Zealand, I think, were the next two places that went back and took a closer look at the KT boundary and discovered that in both of those cases there was also an iridium spike. And then subsequent investigation showed that, yeah, there was a global dusting of iridium. So from that, they were able to calculate, well, how much iridium are we talking about here? And it turned out that it was the quantity of iridium that you might find in a 6-mile asteroid. So then they hypothesized the energy released during that, and it's in the hundreds of millions of megatons. But then they also speculated that there should be a crater. Now, this is in the early 80s, and the skeptics said, well, until you can produce a crater, we're not going to buy into this. It was volcanoes or something else that it took, maybe 1 million years for the dinosaurs to die off, because what you're talking about would be an extinction event that happened essentially instantaneously in the geological sense. Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, then in the early 90s, they did find the crater buried under, half a kilometer of limestone bedrock, flanking the northern coast of the Yucatan Peninsula. And they did the dating, it dated precisely to the boundary, and it was exactly what would be predicted from the impact of a 6-mile asteroid. So that pretty much shut up a lot of the critics, and it's pretty much now accepted that it was a consensus amongst the scientists that have looked at this, that, yeah, there were the geologists, the paleontologists, that, yeah, there was this big impact. Yeah. Now, that, to me, if we want to use an analogy, when you're talking about a 6-mile space rock slamming into the Earth, imagine, in human scale weapons, a 45. Going to blow a big hole in you. A 45 caliber bullet's going to be
damaging, to say the least.
Very damaging, yes. Now, on the other hand, think about a shotgun blast. So we may be looking at both, but the shotgun blasts may actually be more common than the big single impacts. Mm-hmm. And shotgun blasts might be, imagine encountering a cluster. I'm going to stop the share. Did I stop the share?
Yeah, you did.
Good. Okay. So I have a graphic I found online that shows the Leonid stream, and you can actually see that it is not uniformly dense throughout its orbit. Okay, it is still clumped in certain places. So if you have a clump, and the Earth goes through that where the density of the material is much greater, mm-hmm. Yeah, then the probabilities of an encounter increase substantially. I should have it right in here somewhere. I don't want to take up too much time looking for this stuff, but I'll find it in a second here. But the point is that Tunguska was one object, but it may be that there are times when Earth runs into a clump or a cluster, maybe a swarm, using the term, and then there could be multiple encounters of Tunguska-sized objects. Now, if you have those spread over a large area of terrain or even over the ocean, the problem is, that the larger, when you get up to the half-kilometer or kilometer diameter objects, they're striking the Earth, and they leave very big impact scars. They leave craters. Those craters might get infilled with sediment over time, but they're still detectable. We call them astrobleeds now, star wounds, but they're still detectable. And so, but a Tunguska is detectable, okay, because it exploded over a forest, an old-growth forest, and knocked over, tens of millions of trees that were flattened. They were still there. In fact, some of those trees that got knocked over are still to be found there. At least when Americans started going and visiting the Tunguska site in the 90s after the end of the Cold War, there were photographs that came out that showed more recent Yeah, I mean, look at here. Yeah, look at that. This is the tree growth. I mean, the tree destruction that you see here. Um, it's great that this stuff is so available now online. Uh, but yeah, so this would essentially be the area of tree growth.
Yeah.
I mean, of forest destruction was about the same as a major urban area. So, uh, but what you see here is when you look into it is that the longer or the older the meteor stream is, the more diffuse it becomes, and the more uniformly distributed about its orbit that it becomes. Whereas if it's a younger meteor stream, again, remember, it's formed by a comet breaking up. So that comet breaks up, and in the early stages of its breaking up, there's going to be all of the material is going to be relatively concentrated. And then as it continues to orbit around the sun and Jupiter, that material becomes spread out, it becomes diffused, and eventually it will be pretty much uniformly distributed around the whole orbit. But the early stages of it, there's going to be a heterogeneity to the orbital stream. Now, if the Earth passes through a place where it's relatively sparse, low probability of impact. If it passes into an area where it's relatively densely clustered, a much higher probability of an impact. So that's kind of what we're dealing with. I mean, a lot of this is just, we're still in the early stages of figuring all of this out. Our Earth's relation to what transpires in the cosmic domain. And from that standpoint, it's important, I think, that we learn these lessons,
Yeah.
and apply them to our to our long-term planning. How are we going to survive as a civilization? And part of the problem is that people just don't take it seriously. It's just not, mainstream news will report, there was this near miss, in September of an object that could wipe out an area the size of Pennsylvania if it was to hit us. And it just came by separated by a cosmic whisker. Now, but it gets reported, then it's forgotten. It's not part of the mainstream discussion or part of the mainstream narrative. It's just considered too big, too outside, but it isn't. And I'm of the mind it's probably going to require something to happen. There was a flurry of interest after Chelyabinsk. Now there, you had 1,500 people injured, but nobody was directly killed. However, if that object had been slightly larger or on a slightly steeper incline as it's coming in, you might have had 1,500 people killed. Now, if that were to occur, then it would probably warrant a much higher degree of attention. Now, one of my concerns is that when we have a situation where we have international tensions, such as we now have, because the on radar and on early detection warning systems sometimes have a difficult time differentiating between what would be an asteroid or an object coming in and a missile launch. So what it does is creates the potential for misinterpretation. It might be a totally natural event that is mistaken for a missile launch. And that, to me, is one more reason why we need to begin to de-escalate these international tensions.
Yeah. So if a comet or a comet fragment is being misinterpreted as a missile, it would have to be very close to us at that point, correct? What could we do before we kind of talk about the internal threat to the world and how we get how we can start to address that? What can we do? I know you've talked about this. You've never really given me too many details about this, but how do we protect ourselves?
Well, at this point, we don't really have the means to protect ourselves against the Tunguska object because the problem there is in fact, some of the recent of close encounters, we didn't detect them until they'd actually already passed us, or we detect it 3 days or a week before, the close encounter.
Right.
And in fact, one of my Squaring the Circle podcasts within the archive of apocalyptic phenomena that I'm working on, still going to be adding more episodes to it. But yeah, it has many examples of where the lead time between discovery and close passage was very narrow, where there wouldn't have been time to do anything. Now, of course, the smaller it is, the harder it is to detect. The larger it is, the easier it is to detect. Yet this thing that passed us in September was over 500, maybe up to, some estimates put it at 800 feet in diameter. I think it was just discovered, a few weeks before. So, again, slightly different trajectory. If that thing encountered Earth, you'd have a fireball 3 miles in diameter that would incinerate. If it was over a populated area, it would instantly incinerate 1 million people or more and destroy an area about the size of the state of Pennsylvania. And it would have global climatological and environmental consequences.
Right.
So
that kind of gets us, you were going in this direction, but currently we don't have the means to protect ourselves. And you were starting to say that our solutions are fairly limited as far as the species go. And it involves a species-wide effort in order to do this. And currently, we don't really get along too well as a species when you're looking.
This is an important point you bring up, because we are realizing now, and you see, we're stuck in some really, in my mind, obsolete paradigms. One of them is our own history. Essentially this model, which already, anybody who looks at history and prehistory knows that the model that we've sort of invoked to explain the rise of civilization has been a sort of an exponential curve. For tens of thousands of years, for hundreds of millennia, the curve is down here, not much is happening. And then somewhere around 3 centuries ago, it really starts picking up, and then it just goes exponential in the 20th century and where we're at now. So that exponential curve is one model of history. Whereas I think the evidence is more consistent with a model of history that would be sawtooth. Ups and downs, interruptions. Just like, think about how the Darwinian model of the evolution of life has had to have been modified from a smoothly linear kind of a model where in the Darwinian model, let's say you've got 2 species that are not viable mates anymore. Mm-hmm. They're distinct. So, that's the basic criteria for saying differentiating one species from another species. We can certainly go into the genetics of it, but overall, that's the basic idea, is that if they can co-create and produce offspring, they're basically the same species. But so you've got 2 species, which then are the endpoints of a continuum, right? And now, to my problem with the Darwinian models of evolution has always been, well, if you're talking about 2 different species and they're the endpoints of a continuum, then the vast majority of interim species should be detectable in the fossil record, but they're not really. What it seems is that evolution goes by jumps and leaps. There's interruptions and then it jumps. So in the aftermath of the great catastrophes that have wiped out a lot of species, like we talked about the KT, we could talk about the KT, the Permian Triassic, the Endordovician, the late Devonian, the Triassic Jurassic. Each of these, many of the geological boundaries are now known to be punctuated by these tremendous global extinction level events. So what happens? You look at the fossil record, it might be densely populated up to some particular boundary, and then boom, it's empty, or 10% or 20% or 30% of species, 70% of the species that were on one side of the boundary are now gone. And so you have this hiatus, and then whatever happens, called a rapid speciation event, all of a sudden, a lot of species suddenly show up, and it repopulates the biome. And at this point, I don't know what the latest speculation is on what's driving rapid speciation events. But again, what it creates is a sawtooth model of the history of life. And I think that, I think the same model applies to human civilization. And given, and I make this point over and over again, given that we're making the assumption now based upon skeletal remains that modern humans, like ourselves, with our own cranial capacity, in fact, some evidence actually suggests that our modern Holocene brains have shrunk by 10 or 15%. And I don't know why we would assume that if that's true, and I have some recent papers on that I haven't really digested yet, but they seem to make a pretty strong case based upon empirical data that brain size of modern humans is less than that of ancient humans. Now, if brain size is a function of intelligence, and what it really is, I mean, like elephants can have bigger brains than humans, but it's the ratio of brain mass to body mass. That's the important thing. The more the brain mass to the body mass, the more intelligent. So we have a very high brain to body mass ratio, and we're intelligent. Well, assuming that the ancient peoples were roughly the same size as us, the implication would be that they had to be, the conservative implication be that they were as intelligent as us. Now, and modern humans who have created science and industry and technology and inventions and all the things that we're doing that are products of our intelligence. Well, if that was the case for our ancestors that existed for perhaps 200,000 years or longer, is what the fossil evidence is now really pointing to, that direction, that maybe there were modern humans, ancestors of ours, 150 to 200,000 years ago. How is it possible that in all of that time, no one came up with accumulative learning that could be passed on from generation to generation? Were they not observing nature? Were they not observing, that things fall? Were they not looking at the sky? It's like, how do we even, I can't even get in my head that you would have that many generations, and it would have been thousands of generations of humans that did not come up with any system of accumulated learning that could then morph into what we think of as scientific.
Yeah, we're looking at ourselves as the center, which is kind of a curse. Everything has to revolve around us or logically make its way from us first. It's not
meaning you're talking about meaning us now, modern us. Modern us.
Modern us. And really what modern us is just a perspective of what we think our history is and putting ourselves in it. We say modern us, so we've got these beautiful black mirrors that show us what your favorite celebrity or your favorite food is and how to make it. And anything before that couldn't have nearly been as great as this. Nothing could have been as advanced as this.
Right.
And we're just looking at it in the context of our idea of advancement, our idea of what is great and what's not great. And then we have a limited sense of what actually affects us, which I think this brings us to where you were going with that point, is our perspective on what affects us as human beings is, for the most part, limited to what has affected us since we've been alive, or like over the last 1,000 years before that. And it seems like leadership in today's world doesn't seem to account for the 1,000 years before us, because they would find out that we're getting hit by objects from space.
Well, I think,
So
our political systems have degenerated, and what we have are people in power who are not real authentic leaders.
Exactly.
And if you
Well put.
are an authentic leader, you're going to get ostracized, you're going to get shunned, you're going to get exiled, you're going to get offed. Somehow you're going to get discredited. And so what we have is
There's gonna
massive
be
fraud.
there's gonna be circling fog, and the waters are gonna become murkier and murkier around people who are real leaders, who are doing things that are focused on the people, on serving the people.
Yes. And a true leader, to me, needs to, first of all, they need to have a high degree of intelligence, and they need to be able to comprehend the big picture. I mean, that's, I think, a prerequisite. You got to understand the big picture because, when you look at the micro scale of things, you're going to only see that, but you're not going to see how it fits in to the larger socio-political landscape, the environmental landscape, and then even beyond that in the cosmic landscape. And I've been saying for years now, we have to start thinking in cosmic terms because, number one, we know now that our planet that we live on is part of a cosmic system. And slight changes in that cosmic system can have big effects down here on the surface of the Earth. And I think that the true model of history, prehistory, is that there likely been multiple civilizations that have arisen that we could consider advanced, sophisticated, maybe scientific, but not necessarily look anything like our civilization. Because I think we know enough now to say, okay, well, we've built this industrial and technological civilization on the exploitation of energy. And without that, you're not going to be in a position to move much beyond, a tribal type existence and what has enabled us to move beyond a system like that is our control and utilization of energy.
Yep.
But we're habituated to thinking that the use of fossil fuels is the predominant use of energy. But like you and I both know enough now that plasma physics is showing us that there's a whole nother realm of energy that we potentially could be utilizing not too far into the future.
And it points backwards too.
And it points backwards too. Exactly. That's exactly it. And if you had a plasma-based civilization, it's not going to look anything like necessarily like ours. It's not going to require the type of infrastructure we've created for energy production, distribution, and consumption. Not necessarily at all.
It's a great point. Like the idea that kind of underlies plasma physics, or what my interpretation of it is much of this is about finding the patterns of nature and becoming in alignment with them. You're trying to have resonance with this. So you don't have these structures, don't have this infrastructure that sticks apart from it. It serves the same, it's built in the same pattern or the same structure as the way it will operate. It's the idea of like form will lead to function versus, hey, we have to make this thing function and then stick it in whatever we need today. Like we have a model of extraction constantly in our world.
Maybe one of our future conversations, up until, 3 to 5 years ago, when I really started becoming more aware of the potential of plasma and plasma physics for creating towards the end of energy use, I was coming up very much to that conclusion based upon studies of ancient traditions, including ideas that there will be these anomalous things even in our more recent historical past that seem to imply some working knowledge of some natural law that we've forgotten. And of course, as a builder, the thing that comes to my mind most prominently is the movement of and building of megastones, megalithic architecture,
right?
Which we find all over the world. And I've made this point recently, but I don't get tired of making it because I think it's an important insight. Is that if you we build and we use stone today, yet most of the stone we are now using is veneer stone. Most of our larger buildings are steel-framed buildings, and if they look like stone, it's not really, it's not structural stone, it's veneer stone. But we do find a lot of structural stone buildings, in the 1800s in Europe, say first half of the 20th century, of course phased out, but a lot of the really beautiful buildings were built with structural stone. But if we look at the stones that were being used, we're not seeing 10-ton, 20-ton, 30-ton stones. We're looking at stones that might weigh anywhere from 50 to a couple of hundred pounds. But most of them are going to be within the realm that a man, a strong man, a stonemason, was able to,
Move.
pick up and
Carry,
move.
yeah.
Exactly right. Now, we have the capability of moving 10-ton, 20-ton, 30-ton stones. We do. We have the machinery that can do that. But why don't we build with 20-ton stones? Well, first of all, it would be totally uneconomical to try to do that. The quarrying efforts, we can quarry 20 and 30-ton stones, absolutely. But when you think of the energy expended in quarrying, the energy expended in transporting, the energy expended in assembling, and the challenges of that clearly would make it an uneconomical prospect for us today. That principle is going to apply 1,000-fold to a nomadic culture, foragers, hunter-gatherers, or subsistence farmers. And in no case of megalithic structures are we looking at anything outside of that. I mean,
I've seen so many comments of people just saying no, they were just into it.
They were just into it. No, first thing what I would do is I would take those people who make idiotic comments like that, and I'd say, come out to a building site with me, one of my next projects where we might have to emplace a 1-ton steel I-beam.
Yeah.
No, you have no idea what you're talking about. They were just into it. Look, I've made the point that all the ancient cultures, if there were dozens of them, that were capable of megalithic stonework, if you just said one, okay, maybe you could make that argument. For whatever reason, these guys were really eccentric. They were possessed and obsessive about something that...
Moving big shit. That's what
hey,
we're
going to move.
Do.
Exactly. Okay, I could buy that. Okay, whatever. Yeah, I guess these guys, we don't know what motivated them in the first place to want to move big shit. But yeah, but when you start talking about multiple cultures all over the world that are doing this, it makes no sense at all. It makes no sense for a primitive society that's barely beyond the level of subsistence farming or nomadic foraging and hunter-gathering to do that.
Right.
You would have to have a very well-established society, first of all, with a division of labor. You've got enough leisure time would be prerequisite because, look, if we're talking about, strictly manpower, I mean, good Lord, we're talking about thousands and thousands of people employed in this process. Well, they've got to be fed. They've got to be clothed. They've got to be sheltered. All of that means that off the scene, off the stage, are all of these people that are doing all of this stuff, that they're creating enough food to feed these armies of workers while they're quarrying a 20 or 30-ton stone and moving it hundreds of miles and then assembling it into a temple or a building or whatever it is that they're a henge. So that right there clearly requires and implies that there had to have been a high level of social organization around these things. And which to me, again, is such a disconnect between our pictures of what these people were, what they were doing, how they were living, what was their life ways, so on, and the fact that you've got these big stones that are sitting out there. To me, they're like the 800-pound gorillas sitting in the corner of the room that modern archaeology and modern prehistory is just sort of ignoring, imagining that, yeah, oh, well, they were into it, they did it, they decided, all over the world, ancient cultures decided to move big shit around. It doesn't make sense.
Right.
And I, you can bring in all these arguments that I've heard. I mean, when I listen to, like, the Joe Rogan debate there with Dibble and Graham Hancock, which I've only heard a few minutes of, but I'd heard enough to know that, okay, here's the, okay, there was no advanced cultures because we don't find a pottery in prehistoric times. That's basically what the evidence comes down to. We don't find a pottery. But, these archaeologists, for the most part, they're not trained in geology. And then, from the geological perspective, even most geologists are not trained in catastrophist geology.
Right.
So catastrophist geology is a very, almost kind of like an exclusive realm. Most geologists are trained and go to work for industry and the government. When they work for industry, what are they doing? They're exploring for hydrocarbons, for minerals. They're not really looking at the surface landscape and what the story it has to tell. They're not interested in mass extinctions. They might use fossils, of course, just to identify the age of a particular stratum. For government, same thing. They're not looking through that lens of the discontinuities within the geological continuum. There's a whole subfield of geology that's sort of emerged over the last 20 to 40 years, but it hasn't really, I don't think, really manifested as the type of thinking change, the revolutionary thinking in our own prehistory models. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that where we started with this is we're investigating a potential different set or one civilization that was advanced but looked different than ours. And we're in this period of time where plasma physics is, let's say, making a return to, I'm not going to say fully mainstream, but it's becoming widely considered and widely investigated. And we are able to look back at history and say, oh, okay, well, here's this other form of energy harnessing and I mean, how we would utilize energy, how we would harness it, and it could lend itself to a completely different society. Or a society that was advanced but looked completely different than ours. And you said this in like about 10 minutes ago. You said that these societies, let's pretend like they were more primitive than us. They would be doing this individually. We now have this communication technology as well in our world today. And we are also finding out about our history and ourselves and how things may be different, which brings us, I mean, I think that kind of gives us a top perspective. It's something that is grounding to say, where you're like, oh, well, maybe everything is not as simple as I've made it out to be. Maybe there is things beyond myself. And we have this world where we're starting to realize that. And there's this other end of it where it seems like much of the world in the geopolitical scale and the fight for resources is focused around the old paradigm, which is everything is this way and it will always be this way and it has always been this way. And in order for us to succeed, our country, our nation, our whatever, our organization needs to win by this set of rules. And we're seeing that happen. So, I mean, what happened this morning, Randall? Or maybe it was yesterday, but there was something that happened with the current president of the United States and the Ukrainian war.
Well, yeah. So the Biden administration, and I almost hate to say Biden administration because clearly Biden is not making any decisions at all. My interpretation of what's going on is that he has no idea what's going on, and there are obviously people behind the scenes making decisions. It's not Kamala. We see
Right.
nothing from her. She's, since Biden is clearly incapacitated and incapable of ruling, our constitutional system says that the vice president then steps in and takes over the role of president.
Yep.
Right? Well, that's not happening. I mean, there's so much going on right now that needs to be addressed by true and authentic leaders. And I'm sorry, I mean, if there's any Kamala Harris supporters listening, but this woman is clueless. She's and any true leader who was picked to be the second highest office in the land, with the incapacitation of the president, would be stepping into the role and saying, here's what we have to do. They would take over, and they would be showing that they're actually leaders. So, I mean, what we're seeing right now is the evidence that there was no presidential qualities with this person at all, or we would now be seeing them manifest, which we're not. Somebody made the decision that now Ukraine can go ahead and use American-made hypersonic missiles to strike deep into Russia.
Yep.
That's what happened today. And virtually nobody realizes what the implications of that are and how that escalates this, how it intensifies international dangers and tensions and so on. And what the ultimate goal here is, I don't know if there's anything rational, because personally I think these people are insane that are making these decisions. But big part of the problem now is that, look, you've got maybe not half, but a big segment of the American population are all distraught because Kamala Harris didn't get elected. They're going hysteric. We see their stuff, what is it, the 4Bs now, right? What is that? You know what I'm talking about?
Oh.
The women that are shaving their heads.
Oh,
have you
yeah.
seen that?
Yeah.
They're not going to get married. They're not going to have men in their life. They're not going to have children. In protest, right? That Harris did not get elected.
Right. To kind of go to the point that what you said, because it's so often that it's brushed over, and it probably will be for a little while. But the current administration, I guess we could say the administration that is full of that is influenced by the military-industrial complex, has decided that Ukraine, Zelensky can use U.S.-supplied weapons for long-range strikes. And this is coming at what seems to be a rapid pace. It seems to be something that consistently is validating, if you hold the perspective that it seems like there's something going on outside of just a war, that the war is not just because Russia advanced and that there might be other things going on. This validates that very much, because there was even reservations from the administration. There was reservations from Joe Biden himself, whether he's making decisions or not. It is now a fast track to essentially what seems to escalate a war, which is what we bring this up now, because this is the internal threat. This is the internal threat to humans. We talked about the first hour of this conversation was all about external threats to human extinction, which led us to, in order for us to solve that problem, we need to start looking to our past, and we need to start communicating with each other. And our internal threat to ourselves kind of lends itself to the same solution to some extent. So what is, from your perspective, Randall, what do you think the current administration, while they're still in office, and then Trump administration is going to step in January, what do you think we need to do in order to solve this?
Taking what Trump has said at face value, and what seems to be reflected in a lot of his cabinet picks, is that they want to end the war in Ukraine. It's even been suggested that Trump might be seeking détente with Putin and the Russians. Now, what we see, of course, is he's being attacked. I saw this ridiculous meme the other day showing Putin like a big, I don't know, it was disgusting. Not Putin, it was, it was Trump, like with an infant body, but Trump's face sitting in the lap of Putin. Like, look, see, here's the thing. We came through 40 some years of Cold War without annihilating ourselves. How did we do that? By having regular dialogue between America and the Soviet Union. We had diplomacy. We had high-level meetings between the American leaders and the Soviet Union leaders. Going right from coming out of World War II, we had Truman meeting with Stalin. As bad as Stalin was, now Putin is not even remotely close to Stalin. Yet here Truman, the American president, sits down and negotiates with Stalin. But we can come right through and look at Eisenhower, Kennedy meeting with Khrushchev. We can look at, imagine, Kennedy or imagine Nixon meeting with Brezhnev. Do you think that the media would then come and portray Nixon as like picturing him as like a dog on a leash with Brezhnev holding the leash? No, nothing like that wouldn't have even been conceivable, because people were sane enough to know that to avoid a confrontation, we had to have dialogue. We had to have summit meetings between the leaders. Do you think when Ronald Reagan met with Gorbachev, you think they would have portrayed anything like this disgusting cartoon that I saw just a couple of days ago? And then would you think they would have said, oh, well, Reagan is just Gorbachev's stooge? No. How did we avoid nuclear annihilation in October of 1962? It was summit dialogue between Kennedy and Khrushchev. Yeah. Now, the thing is, people don't realize is that Khrushchev and the Russians back then had a legitimate argument, which is that the United States had based intermediate range missiles. I believe it was in Greece and Turkey.
Yep,
we can look
exactly.
that up. Yeah, and they were a direct threat to the Russian homeland. The attempt to deploy intermediate range missiles in Cuba by the Soviets was a direct response to that. Well, so what happened is you had a bunch of back-channel communications going on. You had a dialogue between Kennedy and Khrushchev. Mm-hmm. Kennedy, he was astute enough to understand, yeah, I can get it. I can understand why they don't like having nuclear-capable missiles on their borders. So what Kennedy did said, look, I've got to mollify these hardliners in my own government, and also I have to, cannot create the impression that I'm caving into you, so here's what we'll work out. You turn your ships around, because they were coming, and there were hawks within the Kennedy administration that were ready then to go to war. Like, totally not considering the fact that if you go to war with the Soviet Union, it'll almost certainly go nuclear. Then what? Let's suppose that we could completely annihilate the Soviet Union with our own missiles, first strike missiles, say, as an example, and get no retaliatory response at all. Yeah, we won the war. Well, a week, 2 weeks later, Americans are becoming poisoned by radiation.
The entire world.
The entire world, yes. So the whole thing, mutual assured destruction. What was the acronym? MAD. It was MAD. What's going on now is MAD, because we're repeating, we came this close in 1962 to a nuclear war. Now, what are we doing? We're repeating. We're doing the same thing. We're using Ukraine. We want to deploy. Now the missiles that they're talking about attacking Russia with are not nuclear. But, I mean, let's think about this for a minute. What if any power, let's say Russia or China or any other power, was deploying intermediate range missiles in Cuba or Mexico or, anywhere where those could reach the United States, what would be our response? Well,
Fight.
yeah, I mean, what would be our response? Why do we expect it to be any different for the Russians? And why are we so fucking intent on putting nuclear-capable missiles, and that was what the whole thing really came down to, in Ukraine? Why, after Daddy Bush, promised the Russians, Gorbachev, that, look, if you agree to the reunification of Germany. Now remember, Russia fought 2 world wars against Germany. Second World War, it's estimated 20 million Russians died fighting Germany, right? They did not want the reunification of Germany because they thought by a divided Germany is going to be much less of a threat. A divided Germany is not going to be able to rearm like they did between World War I and World War II and ever threaten us again. That was their primary objective. And can you imagine if, the United States had fought a war that was literally a land invasion across our border and 20 million Americans died? What would be our post-war response, right? Whatever allowed that threat to occur, we would be opposed to it, and we would be promoting anything that could prevent that kind of a threat from reemerging. So the Soviet Union was dead set against the reunification of Germany in the aftermath of World War II. We agreed to that. Okay, so now fast forward, we're getting into the 80s, into the 90s. The German people themselves want a reunification. We know that East Germany was totally a corrupt communist nation, and basically the negotiation went like this. You support the reunification of Germany. Now, this is right there leading up to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the immediate aftermath. You support the reunification of Germany, and we vow to you, we promise you, that we will not expand NATO 1 inch, not 1 inch to the east. Gorbachev went back, said, talked to the people, talked to his other leaders in the Politburo and so on, came back and said, well, we've got hardliners that don't believe you're going to honor that commitment, but we're going to go with it. So what happens? So now the Clinton administration comes along and immediately starts recruiting the former Eastern Bloc countries into NATO. And one by one, we're moving right up to the Russian border. Why? Why are we doing this? Well, it's a part of a longer, larger term plan of global conquest. That's absolutely what it is. And what's the motive? The motive is the control of global resources. And that's what the whole Ukrainian conflict is all about. Eastern Ukraine particularly is unbelievably rich in natural gas, in coal, in precious metals, and so on, estimated between 11 and 12 trillion dollars conservatively. That's what it's about. That's what it's about. So we've got factions in the Biden administration that are willing to risk World War III to get control of those resources. Most Americans are completely oblivious to what's going down. But what happened today, it should be concerning to every American that wants to have a future. And every parent out there that has a child should be concerned about this. But what is happening? What we see is people who should be opposing this, like in my youth, coming up, who was opposing the wars? It was the left.
Yep.
Who was out there demonstrating against, who was it, banned the bomb movement in the early 60s, in the aftermath of Cuban Missile Crisis?
I mean, you can go back to 2000. You can go back
exactly.
way sooner than that.
What has happened to the left? They've gone insane. I don't know what it is. I mean, look, there's a few of them. There's a small contingent of them that I still get it. But in my day, the left was the primary advocates of peace, of freedom, free speech. Didn't necessarily have to agree with their economic policies. But now, what is the left doing? The left is hysterical over. You see him online. They're obsessing over Trump. Yet here's Trump, the guy who says, "I'm going to end the war in Ukraine."
Yeah,
People,
and
get this into fucking perspective, okay?
yeah. Yeah, I think that we've talked about this outside of this podcast as well. You're pointing to the fact that this, I guess you can call it an institution, party, organization has been hijacked by something. And the something has an objective of resource extraction and some type of global control of, let's just say, resources for the sake of simplicity. And the left in the United States is one, and there's others all around the world, is one of these hijacked machines and organizations that are here to essentially do the bidding of this. And we have a conversation mapped out that we're going to do on one of these podcasts, but it's worth it to bring up right now, talking about the rise and fall of the US dollar and kind of how this money has shifted. And you revealed something to me that caused me to do a lot of research on this. And it was after young Bush, the influence of, or people's sentiment towards wars shifted from the right, and they were somewhat like, I don't want to be a part of this anymore, because their sons went overseas, sons and daughters, but sons fought overseas and were dying and were coming back and saying, like, I don't know what I'm fighting for. I don't know what this war is. So in the right, in the conservative party, the voters started to shift away from wars. It became more about protection here versus conquest out there. And you saw all of this money shift, all of this military industrial complex dollars go towards the left, go towards the DNC specifically. And then you had the emergence of Barack Obama, and what happens there. We don't have to go through all of that, but that's kind of where the shift happened. Because you're alluding to this, you're saying in the 60s, like, the Liberal Party, the left, was the people who were fighting for free speech, anti-war, excuse me. And now it shows you that the parties are just as malleable and easily manipulated by large dollars, big influence, as people are. Because the same thing's happening with people.
Yeah.
It's just happening at a different scale. So what do we, this conversation is about threats to ourselves, and then how do we get out of them, or how do we solve them?
Well,
how do we solve it, Randall? Tell us.
Well, okay. So I'm going to be, I might be overly optimistic here. I'm looking at the rhetoric coming out of the Donald Trump camp. And what I'm hearing is that there's definitely a shift towards, like, quote unquote, America first. Why are we pumping billions of dollars into Ukraine? And it's an enormous, the amounts that are publicly being presented are way too low from what they're actually getting. Same with what's going on with Israel. Now the problem is that we got a bunch of Israel supporters in the Trump administration, so I don't know we're going to see any change in policy there, although Trump did come out and say that Netanyahu was going to have this thing wrapped up by Inauguration Day.
Yeah.
Well, right after he says, well, so what does Netanyahu do? They invade Lebanon. They've bombed a quarter of Beirut into oblivion. And the Biden administration just keeps handing it over. And all of these hysterical liberals are like this. We're not going to talk about it. We don't want to see it. We don't want to do this. We're going to vote for the Kamala Harris and the Democrats because Trump is a narcissist and he said some gross things. But because of that, we're going to go ahead and vote for an administration that has basically started two wars. and has greenlighted 2 wars, has spent a couple of $100 billion that could have gone to help Americans in need, right? It's just completely crazy. And so now they're all upset, and you can see the stuff they're coming with online. You know, again, I saw somebody that I guess we're Facebook friends or something, and he's just completely unhinged in his hatred of Trump. Now, I have plenty of criticisms of Donald Trump, and they're all pretty much based on policy, not on what he may, have said that insulted somebody 10 years ago or whatever, because obviously he's not a saint. Obviously I think he's got a level of arrogance, but I think on some level he really does. I mean, you got to ask, okay, so here's this guy, he had it made, billionaire. Why would he subject himself to all this? Even 2 assassination attempts. I mean, what is his objective here? What is he trying to gain? I mean, and I don't see any evidence that he's really, in this imperialistic mindset. I don't see that. I certainly see it from the Democrats, and I see it from the Rhino Republicans, who, if it wasn't for the Rhino Republicans, they're the ones who are enabling the Democrats, the neocon constituency that's hijacked the Democratic Party. And I look at this and I go, okay, 2020, to me, it was crystal clear that Joe Biden was unfit for office. In 2020, I mean, I look at this guy, how's anybody voting for this guy? He's already going. I mean, he's going to be gone halfway through his administration. His mind is going to be gone. And yet, right up until that debate where it just became unarguable that he was out to lunch, you had mainstream media saying over and over again, oh, he's as sharp as a tack. Even Kamala Harris was saying, oh, he's as sharp as a tack. Well, how could you have more bullshit shoveled right in front of your face and then swallow it and then go on like you're going to continue to support this regime? It's unbelievable to me. But so I think all of this stuff from, pronouns and gender and LGBTQ and transgender, all of that kind of stuff has been dumped into the educational system towards the purpose of keeping the younger generation distracted. See, when I was coming up, the Vietnam War was, everybody, because there wasn't anybody, 1968, there was nobody who didn't know somebody personally who had been killed or crippled or maimed over there. Certainly by 1968, 1969, I had now at least a dozen kids that I had grown up with who are now in Vietnam. I had one kid that I'd known since we were in kindergarten together, or he was a year older than me, so he would have been in first grade, who was killed over there. And, so there's that's reality. When somebody comes home in a body bag, that's reality, right? Now, when you start arguing about all of this stuff, the transgender issues and all of this is like something that's been created that you're worried about that, and you're getting spoon-fed this stuff, from the time you're in grade school, and by the time you get ready to graduate from high school, you're confused.
Right.
It's like, however, I think it's backfiring, and I think that there's a lot of young people, and I say young people, I would include you because, you're a young person compared to me. I'm a young person, but I'm
pretty young.
I'm an old young person.
You are. You got a young spirit, Randall.
You're an old young person.
I'll take it.
And I'm a young old person. Did I say that right? Okay. Anyways,
so
the war, I had it by a fluke. I did not get drafted, and I've told that story many times. I don't need to repeat it here, but basically I got busted, and I was a pending felon when I got called up. Of course, my case amounted to absolutely nothing, and it got thrown out of court when it was finally settled. But in that interim, I went for the draft, and they rejected me because I was at the time a pending felon because I had been arrested with one joint, one one doobie.
We'll link. Yeah, you've told the story. I'll link to this story for everybody who's curious about this on our
Yeah,
last
because
podcast.
people ask me sometimes about that. Because yeah, I mean, I was a low number in the lottery. I would have gone unless I, you know, fled to Canada or managed to get enrolled in college. But the thing was, is I wasn't going to college at the time. I was following my own educational path, as I still do. Um, but yeah, it was just a fluke. But instinctively, I knew on some level. Listen, I can't imagine that I would go over there and, because even at that time, I knew enough to know, look, the Vietnamese people are no threat to us at all. But again, it was about resources. Anti-communism was invoked as the rationale, but it was all about resources, primarily um, oil deposits that were believed to be in the Gulf of Tonkin, I believe it was. And so again, we have to go over there and control the government. If the communists get it, then the communists are going to have that oil, and we're not.
Yeah, so you're pointing to a lot of really good examples, some from older times and some from modern times, of this confusion that people have towards what's important. When you're obsessed with the celebrity or the pronoun or being offended, then you don't think about the dragons from the sky that may crash into Earth.
Right. You don't think about
everything.
That. You don't look
think
at
about the wars.
Yeah, yeah. So you'll see that like the Biden-Harris administration, they've come out, they've got these very narrow focused hot button issues that a lot of the younger people, and I'll say younger, I'll go up to in their early 30s, have actually been sort of primed and indoctrinated to be reactive to. Like abortion, Now, I know women who are in their 50s and 60s who, of course, not affected at all by abortion, and that's their primary issue, which, of course, and what is Donald Trump said? Well, he says, it's up to the states. This is not a federal issue, and I have long felt that. This is where in the Constitution does it say this is a federal issue?
Right.
It's just another one of these issues to distract from the fundamental stuff.
Exactly, and it's very distracting. Something that I'll say is that where you give energy, where you put energy, you get it in return. So in your life, if you think about certain things, you will then get more of that. If you spend it, for a really easy example is like if you spend all your time working on a business, that business is going to grow or it's going to do something because energy is given that way. And when something is so compelling, generally it's because it falls on an extreme of an emotional pull. So, for example, if you don't feel like your life is amounting to what you would want it to be, what you look for is things that make you feel that way. And generally, in human experience over a very long history of time, those things are on extremes. Think about losing somebody you love. Think about the day you get married. Emotional extremes, elation versus despair. And when you're spending energy towards something, what feels meaningful is generally when it's on a extreme end of it, which is what's being hijacked. And which is why it's so distracting, is because people care so much about politics when all of it is essentially a Trojan horse to get people distracted. But today, there's an opportunity that's emerging, and we're talking about it here. The whole point of what we're talking about is to essentially bring awareness to the opportunity of change. And it's not just change within a single policy. It's not just change within the way that we look at women's reproductive rights or the way that we look at the way we fight wars. I use those examples because they're the extreme ones, but the weaponized ones, not extreme ones, excuse me, the weaponized ones. But what we're looking at is we're looking at a paradigm shift as a species. We now have,
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And like I've said, and I say repeatedly, I've got plenty of criticisms of Donald Trump. But interestingly and ironically, what he's doing actually could opened the door to accelerating that paradigm shift. And I think that I think he's still evolving as an individual. I mean, when you look at where he is now compared to where he was in 2016, I don't even think he expected to become, nobody expected him to become president in 2016, even Donald Trump, right? So what does he do is he goes in and he pretty much submits to the pressures that were being put on him. He's taken a much more independent stance now, and, we'll have to see how it plays out. And again, I can go through some of the people that I like.
We'll do that too. I think it'll be interesting for people to hear your perspective on individuals, because so often you hear it from people who actively only communicate about Trump, or like they're like, hey, we're Trump's people, I'm going to tell you what's good about it. Or it's like the other side. It's like, oh, I'm Kamala or Biden person, I'm just going to talk at you. It'd be interesting for people to hear, because what I've learned about you is what I have a lot of respect for in your process is every time we've ever had a conversation, whether it's recorded or not, it's based off of your understanding of it, which is generally research, involves research, and involves years and years of crafting thought processes that allowed you to fight through propaganda and misinformation. And when you present it publicly or to me in a conversation, it's one of, this is my objective view, and I'm willing to change it if other things arrive, but I'm going to present it as it is right now, which will be interesting. I am extremely excited about, the development of plasma physics and people spending energy on that. I think, just like you said, Trump coming into office, based on the people around him and what he's communicated, it can hopefully allow for the United States of America and the rest of the world to start to, number one, communicate consistently, get past these resource extraction focused wars as a primary, because that's that internal thread, and then look outward to say, now that we're not focused on this scarcity mindset of I need this, there's not enough for everybody, this is the only thing that we have, this is the only pie, let's focus on how do we go out into the cosmos, how do we explore the cosmos, and that's going to require global cooperation and communication.
You're hitting a nail on the head, and that's exactly where I've been going with this, which is that, our foreign policy is based upon an obsolete Malthusian worldview, that there's not enough to go around, that resources are finite, and whoever has the biggest stick is going to be able to control the resources. And that's kind of what's driving our foreign policy. The motive to control global resources. Well, as it turns out, we are part of a much larger ecosystem. We are part of a cosmic ecosystem, and that cosmic ecosystem provides everything that the terrestrial environment provides times infinity. Okay? Now, practical steps that we need. First of all, we need to end the war with Russia. We need détente. We need to sit down with all of our supposed global competitors and threats, and that includes China. Sit down with Xi Jinping. Sit down with Putin. Sit down with the mullahs in Iran. Anybody, say, we will talk with anybody, because here's what we need to do. We're all in this together. It's not going to be likely that one nation is going to go down without taking the world with it. Why don't we just...
What an important point, just to highlight that. We live in a time which is different than the past, which is if a nation wants to go down, it could go down with everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a reality. Yeah. It's a reality we have to face. Now, I'm almost hoping for another Tunguska, because that could be the shock that finally wakes us up. Or we get through the next few months without going to World War III, which it seems like certain factions within the Biden administration are pushing for, if for no other reason to dump World War III in Trump's lap and then blame it on him. But if he is sincere that he will bring this war to an end, and if these, to me, they're degenerates. These people that put this stuff out, that they're doing everything they can to sabotage the emergence of dialogue between America and between Russia, between America and between China. I think they're degenerates, right? And I don't know what ultimately they think their motive is, but we need dialogue. We need discussion. We need summit meetings amongst people. I don't know who in the Biden administration, certainly Kamala is not up to a summit meeting with anybody, any world leader. That would be just too cringeworthy and embarrassing to even think about. But what we've got to do, I think, is two things. First of all, we need to seriously look at converting the swords into plowshares. We've got to realize that we cannot persist in a foreign policy of global domination. The term, by the way, that has been used and is still the phrase that describes our interventionist foreign policy is full spectrum domination. Full spectrum domination. So the whole spectrum of military, economic, scientific, etc., we dominate, we can then control the world. Now, it ain't going to work because the world doesn't want to be controlled by Washington, obviously. So what we're going to do is we're going to be, just like now, we're expending billions of dollars in resources pursuing an objective, a geopolitical objective that is not attainable,
right,
that will just lead to endless perpetuating conflict. The paradigm shift is, look, we sit down and we start talking. And just like all leaders have done since the Second World War, right, we talk. Number one, it's called diplomacy. Then we realize that we have a common objective here. And it's like this. We're on a sinking ship, and we're going to fight amongst ourselves while the ship is sinking, and we're all going to go down with the ship. Or let's work together, repair the damage, repair the leaks, and guess what? Look right over there on the horizon is an island that is loaded with everything we need in infinite abundance. Let's fix the ship and go for that. Because, so how does this translate? Number one, just like all the great industrial projects of the past, I'll use the example of Grand Coulee Dam, which is one of my favorite places to visit. It's a monumental dam. It's extraordinarily, it was built in the 30s. And when the Roosevelt administration was letting out the contracts to build the dam, no single entity, no single engineering firm or corporate entity was capable of taking on a project of that magnitude by themselves. So what happened is three of the big industrial firms that had been competitors joined forces. They established a joint venture, and through that cooperative effort, they were able to complete this project in record amount of time. And it's been providing extraordinary amounts of hydraulic power to the Pacific Northwest ever since. So that's what we need. We need to quit this bullshit war fighting over an ever-shrinking pie and go, okay, there's two things that we can do, and they both can be most effectively accomplished through international joint ventures. One is that we need a system of space defense. We need planetary defense system. That's very important. More important than almost nobody realizes how critically important that is. But that's why I'm glad to have this opportunity to talk with you, because in talking with you, you're getting that. And I know that a lot of people are just not aware of it. And once becoming aware of it, yes, that's going to be important. I would much rather spend our resources on creating a planetary defense system than building bombs that are blowing up cities and killing people.
Yeah.
And the second thing is an international space station on the moon, a base on the moon. Why a base on the moon? Well, because the moon is the obvious place from which to launch the exploration of the solar system and the economic development and the colonization of the solar system. And what's interesting is in the last 10 to 20 years, the discovery of water on the moon suddenly makes the colonization of the moon or the building of a lunar base much more feasible.
Mm-hmm.
And the other big obstacle was, cosmic radiation. So most of the models of lunar bases required going underground. And of course, you've got the regolith there, which, the idea was, well, we can burrow into the regolith and we'll cover our infrastructure with the regolith, and that will insulate it from cosmic radiation. But now we know that there are gigantic caves. And those gigantic caves might turn out to be the ideal places to establish bases that would now be accessible to our potentially emerging new whole generation of space propulsion systems, which gets us back to the whole plasma physics things.
Yep.
But how much more awesome and cooler and life-affirming would that be if we could create an international movement to begin the colonization of the solar system? Now, from the moon, it's going to be much more efficient and cost-effective to launch missions to Mars. Now, why would we want to go to Mars for other than just scientific reasons, to try to understand better the evolution of the solar system? Was there life on Mars? To ask all those kinds of really important scientific questions. But from a pragmatic standpoint, once we've established a beachhead on Mars, we now have access to the entire asteroid belt, which, think of, that's the stones the builders rejected. That was the stuff left over from the creation of the solar system. And it's the amount of wealth of raw materials in the asteroid belt is beyond conception. One asteroid might have, and I'll be talking about this and getting into this, into the details of this in a more specific laid out plan, but one asteroid can have trillions of dollars worth of resources in it. Once we're harvesting the riches of space, we now can deindustrialize the Earth. Now, we've developed solar technologies, which, as far as terrestrial applications, they don't make sense because of the fact that, you can build a gigantic solar farm and then you get a hailstorm and they're destroyed. You get clouds. They're not. That's why all of the schemes for turning to alternative energies like solar and wind require massive investment in battery backup power, infrastructure of storage, right?
And not to mention that they have a huge effect on the environment that they're being built on.
Yes.
People don't talk about
Yes, that's right. So, but here's the thing. Take that same solar collector that's sitting down on the surface of the Earth and put it out in space. Put it 5,000 miles up. It can be oriented very economically to constantly and always be oriented toward the sun. 24 hours a day, unfettered solar energy would be falling on that. Estimates I've seen suggest that the amount of energy generated by a 1 square meter of solar energy, solar collector in free space would be on the order of like 10 times what you would get by putting that same solar collector in Death Valley at noon in the middle of summer. So that's where that's where if we don't do that, all of the investment, the billions and billions of dollars that have been invested in developing solar technology, will be wasted. But if we start applying that to the development of space, no, now it's not wasted, because that is the natural place for solar energy to be realistic, to be practical. So that's so I mean,
we have an exciting future ahead of us. We just have to get out of our own way and allow for collaboration to be non-self-serving as its primary.
and
If
it's
we if
yeah.
we care about humanity as a whole and we expand our perspective from the idea of self, whatever, I mean, self can be expanded into an identity of a nation if you want it to be.
Sure.
It's all about an identity and protection of that, which is also, to your point earlier, dripped all the way down into individuals in, if you're talking about uh, pronouns and how you want to be referred. It's the same thing, as above, so below, as above, all the way up and down. We have this idea of there's nothing enough. It's not enough. You must respect me. You must respect my ideas. You must respect this. If in the largest offense is the idea of disrespect, when we have a future ahead of us that looks like having all of the work that we've done with solar work 10 times, it'd be 10 times more effective with all of the work and all of the people who have been sacrificing their lives literally and figuratively for plasma physics over the last 200 years. Having that change the way that humanity is exploring and expanding and interacting. And this all kind of does loop back to or it all kind of has this feeling of something greater than ourselves, which, if you want to look at history, has also been a huge part of every previous civilization. We've lost this idea of, as a whole, it's not just about us. Yes, people have religions, and there's a lot of dedicated Christians, a lot of dedicated Jews, there's a lot of dedicated Muslims, but we've lost this global idea of whatever you believe, whatever it is that you look at, there's something greater than us, and we're here to expand, not to contract.
Yes,
That's
I
where
like
we're
that.
sitting.
We're here to expand. And I think that's expanding. You know, I came to this, I think, realization in the 70s that when we're, you know, in the aftermath of the whole psychedelic era, and then the you know, the rising awareness and popularity of Eastern philosophy and spiritual traditions, you know, which I immersed myself in for a number of years, very, very dedicated to that practice and experience. Then coming sort of full circle, coming back to the Western spiritual tradition with I think, an enhanced perspective, and realizing that through this, say, 5 to 7 year process that I kind of went through starting in 1968 up to about 1975, during which I studied with a Brahmin priest, I studied with a Himalayan Swami, I studied with a Sufi master, several other people who were very well versed in spiritual traditions and so on. What I came back with, and after studying in depth into various religions of the world, I came back to the idea that they're all like, you know, look at our hand. Why is our hand? Can you imagine if it was all thumbs or all index fingers? It wouldn't be a very useful hand, would it? What makes this a useful hand that can take tools up and build a civilization with it is the fact that all 5 of our fingers are different, but they're all part of the same hand.
Yes.
Right? That's how I look at it. And so you've got the different ethnicities, the different races, the different religions, each of which are bringing their unique skill set to the table. And we're now in a position in the 21st century, you know, which we couldn't do 50 years, 100 years, 200 years ago, right? But now we've got access to this global panorama of skills and narratives and stories and unique perspectives on reality that are all kind of coming together. And we have now, I think, the tools at our disposal to create a universal civilization, right? And realize that what unites us is far, far greater than what divides us. But we've got to break out of this straitjacket of this Malthusian thinking, and that's what's driving our foreign policy right now. And I have hope that, you know, basically because I know I've listened to some of the people that Trump is bringing in, and they're all, of course, none of them are beyond criticism, but a lot of the stuff that's being thrown at Tulsi Gabbard or Elon Musk or Vivek Ramaswamy or Robert F. Kennedy is just completely unhinged. And these are people who bring a perspective to the government that is sorely needed, that hasn't been there for a long time.
And hopefully it can act as an example for the world.
That's what I would like to see happen. And so I would really love to see Trump end the war in Ukraine, say, Ukrainians can say whatever you want because you're on the wrong side of history. I'm going to go and I'm going to make peace with the world, and I'm going to propose that we undertake this extraordinary project, which will have multiple consequences. One, because within a generation or two, we can relieve this planet of the burden of our industrial civilization. 100%, we can do that. What I envision, if you want to jump 100 years, couple of 100 years into the future, if we haven't blown it and caused our own extinction, is this. Our colonies are filling the solar system, and we're creating, look at what, now I have plenty of things I don't like about Jeff Bezos, but the one thing I do like is he is the guy who's picked up the mantle of Gerard O'Neill's vision for the human colonization of space. And I look at Richard Branson. There's many things I could criticize about Richard Branson. I want to say, hey, dude, you supporting the Democrats is a big contradiction. But I'm 100% in Virgin Galactic. I want to see people taking vacations to space, because you know what happens? It's like, hey, taking an acid trip. You come back changed. You come back, you go into space, you come back with just like, look what happened to so many of the astronauts during the Apollo program that came back like they'd had a spiritual awakening. And in fact, it's even had a name. It's called the overview effect, is that when you get this perspective of reality, once you've gone outside the planet, you come back, it's almost like you come back believing in God, basically. Some form, not a dogmatic form of God, but God is some kind of an infinite wisdom and power, right? Which I believed all along anyway. So, in the 60s, we did psychedelics. It's interesting that...
We still do them today.
Oh, do we? Oh, I didn't know that. Really? Okay, well, but we were the ones who started it in the 60s, right? You guys are doing that because we did it in the 60s, and a lot of us went to jail for it. But so in the 1960s, at the same time, Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, our first major expansion into space, expansion outward, happened exactly simultaneous with this psychedelic and spiritual and meditative expansion inward. And I just felt like those were reflections of each other.
Yes.
There was a reason they were both happening at the same time, right? And it's no coincidence that these hard-bitten, military-trained astronauts came back from their space excursions, like, blown away. And a lot of them became, in different ways, but came back with this spiritual perspective on reality that they didn't take with them out there. So, I think that a lot of history since then has been about the distraction. And we talked about all these things that I think, I want to make it clear. I have no issue. I'm totally supportive of somebody. I'm in a business where a lot of my clientele are gay and lesbian. Totally 100% supportive. I'm in a business with my building business and my renovation business and my design business. Yeah. And what's ironic to me is a lot of my clientele who are gay and lesbian, who are older, are actually very conservative and as critical of all of this woke agenda as the right, even though they're liberals. They're like, hey, and I've had many conversations over the last few years saying, well, yeah, we've had it made. Look, we're totally comfortable here. Look, we've got a great house. We've got great income. We don't give a shit if there's some dumbass redneck every once in a while insults us. We're beyond that. I have one of my best friends from high school came out as transgender in his 30s. And I'm like 100% accepting if this is real and authentic, and I'm sure it was. Yeah, and I've had several students now in my homeschool classes that were becoming transgender, and I don't know. Of course, by then it was, is this authentic or not? But to me, it's not a question of having issues with transgender people or gay people. My problem is with the weaponization of transgenderism, of racism. There's always going to be racism, right? But it's not exclusively limited to white people. I've lived
It never has been.
Never has been. No, it never has been. And, it's just, they've taken this stuff. If you're criticizing, what's happening with the indoctrination of kids in grade school, putting in, whatever the books about this and that we've all seen. You and I came through grade school. We're never presented with any of that.
And I graduated. I was in grade school, 10 years ago.
Right. Why all of a sudden now do we have to introduce queer theory to second graders? Well, I don't see that as being supportive. I think that's counter. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's to me, it's like undoing the progress we've made, because now it's going to create a backlash. That is not something that needs to be introduced in government schools, but that's what they're doing. And I think there's an agenda there. And a lot of the kids that are turning out, in college age now, that are really the ones going hysterical over being, transgendered, or you use my dead name, or pronouns, and all of this kind of stuff. They're like that first generation to emerge since this indoctrination really went to the next level. And we need to rescue them from that. And I don't know how that's going to best be done. But I will say this. Over the last couple of years, I've met a lot of people your age, I'll say early 30s down to the early 20s, where totally get it. Like women, young women that I could think of 4 couples that I know right now. You may know some of them, Matt Scheidegger and Heather. Do you know them?
I think I met Matt at Cosmic Summit.
Matt, I think he was there. I think you did meet him.
Yeah.
Like, I know them, and I go, okay, when I know this couple, that kind of gives me hope. My friends Aaron and Zoe, he's ex-Navy SEAL. They're down building a farm in Middle Georgia. And what is she doing? She's out there working like my grandmother's worked, and I see them doing that. I've got other friends, younger friends, that totally all of this woke indoctrination and agenda has just not taken on them. And they want to raise families. They want to have community. They're tolerant. So I'm knowing that there's enough of younger people out there who get it. And
I think most do.
I think you're right. I think most do. It's the ones that seem to be getting all of the publicity are the ones who are making the noise, posting all of this. Like I can say these friends of mine are too busy planting crops, taking care of their animals, building their house, to spend time on social media, posting hysterical comments about how horrible Trump is. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. I know what you're saying, and I think that there is a change going on in the world, and obviously my generation has a very large part in this because we're a big part of social media movements, and a lot of the celebrities and large dollars of influence of a consciousness collection, as I like to say it, have to do with people in my generation, or maybe a little bit older, maybe a little bit younger. And the thing that I'm noticing is a lot of people recognize these false idols that have been put up
Mm-hmm.
for a
Mm-hmm.
while as a
Mm-hmm.
spectacle now. Like it's almost, and I think it's an overcorrection, but it's almost become trendy in quotation marks to hate on celebrities and to make fun of them for doing what they're doing. When for a while it was the opposite. Like if I don't know, pick a celebrity. If Kai Cenat, do you know who that is? You know who Kai Cenat is? Probably not. He's a Twitch streamer, but that's like very, very, very Gen Z popularity and even younger. If he's to say, hey, this is my perspective on space exploration or abortion or who you should vote for, people laugh now. They're like, what? What are you talking about? You're the guy who streams all day long. At least in my generation, I think that's shifting. We're now in this time, and you said this a little just very shortly ago, and it got me fired up, man. You're talking about the reflection, like in the 60s, there's the psychedelic movement and there's the space exploration. I guess
Mm-hmm.
70s. They're a reflection of each other, and we have that reflection today. Like I in 2023, I went to Switzerland and India and saw the thunderstorm generator and all of this stuff emerging for the first time. Got to meet all of these people. We started to have more conversations, and that was happening at the same time of what was the uh, getting out of COVID and this major pandemic. And all of this knowledge being revealed over the last 5 years about true history, about uh, ancient history and symbolism that isn't just conspiratorial because somebody
Mm-hmm.
can point to it in connection with the Illuminati or the Masonic community. And all of these things have started to uh, separate themselves from conclusion, which I think is what we're finding now. So much of what my experience growing up was whenever a conversation happens about something that's deep or interesting, the entire purpose of it is conclusion. We need to come to a conclusion. And the conclusion we come to is limited to this box.
Mm-hmm.
And we have now found that I don't find in conversation that it's constantly a fight for conclusion. It's a fight for exploration. And not even a fight, it is exploration. And the boundaries are dissipating because the more and more you explore, the more and more you find things that show you a new doorway. And we have enough people, we have enough smart people, we have enough vibrant, energetic individuals and all age ranges that are excited for this and want this. They're not tired out by the fact of having to do new things, of
Mm-hmm.
having to change, of having to break their paradigm. They're not tired by it. They're excited by it. And we get the opportunity as anybody today to essentially watch the world change in a way that in documented history we've never seen. And that literally might be colonizing other planets, becoming a multiplanetary civilization. And that's extremely exciting at the very, very least.
It's extremely exciting, and I'm subscribed to some of the ideas of panspermia.
I
That
love it. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, that
Dr. Chandra Wickramasinghe and Sir Fred Hoyle, the people who pushed
yes,
that forward. Yeah.
yeah, good. Yeah, I'm glad you know about those guys. Fred Hoyle is gone, but Chandra is still with us. Um, but yeah, if it turns out, and I think it is, that life came from the cosmos, was seeded on Earth, it's gone through, 500 million years of evolution to get to the point where we are now have the capability to return life to the cosmos from which it came. And I think that that's, if we're looking in the grand scheme of things, Earth is the ideal matrix for the propagation of higher life forms. And in fact, there's such a narrow range of parameters that would allow for this to happen that it almost does seem like, well, if we're just looking at probabilities, what's the probabilities of planets forming, evolving, that have just exactly the right conditions? It has to be extremely, extremely rare, right?
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
I mean, get rid of the moon, we're gone. The moon plays a very important role in creating an intertidal zone. So if first of all, life has to form in a marine environment, but then in order to evolve larger brains, you have to be a terrestrial-based species. So how do you get life from the oceans to the land? Well, you have to create a zone, an overlap zone, and that's what the intertidal zone is, which of course is totally a function of the presence of the moon. The other thing is that the moon acts as a stabilizing force that prevents the planet from rocking erratically or chaotically on its axis, which again would be very not conducive to the formation of anything other than microbial or very low-level life. The third thing, which I think is something that is not so outlandish, is that, and it may be something that, interestingly, in the more exotic scenarios that I discussed, that it could provide a place of refuge in the event of a global catastrophe, particularly if we had already set up colonies on the moon and had transferred our technology and our scientific knowledge and all the other things that make society and life on Earth worth living. We create seed banks, we create places where we preserve all of the things, the scientific and technological information on the moon. And this has actually been proposed by scientists ever since the 90s. They've been proposing that it's just, wow, it's there. Nature has provided global terrestrial civilization with a potential ark in the case of a global catastrophe. Now, we know we had a global catastrophe 12 to 13,000 years ago. And we know from this that the extreme nature of that global catastrophe was that if it were to recur again today, civilization, everything we built in the last 10,000 years is pretty much erased. That would be the consequence of it. And I think that might be one reason why the Younger Dryas impact idea has gotten so much resistance, because the implications of it are profound. That in our recent geological history, there were events which would be planetary civilization killer if it were to recur again. And then that raises the idea of, well, what was lost during the Younger Dryas? And again, even mainstream scientists, I started my studies of catastrophism over 40 years ago. There was no such, you can't go enroll in any college course of catastrophism. It doesn't exist. You have to pull it together. You pull it, catastrophism as a discipline unto itself is drawn from geology, from astronomy, from paleontology, from biology, from all of these things are feeding into this model of Earth's catastrophic history, right? Prehistory. The idea of why did civilizations disappear? What happened at the end of the Bronze Age that was so devastating to all of the cultures around the Mediterranean, right? Well, the answer is it was probably a couple of things working in tandem: hypervelocity impacts and volcanism. And we now have enough evidence in hand to put forth a pretty convincing theory that the two might be intimately related. Hypervelocity impact may trigger massive seismic responses and volcanic responses. And there's some very interesting evidence supporting that conclusion, which again leads us to this unified model of Earth history, that the solar system is a unified system. It all works together. And if you were to change the parameters of it even a little bit, it completely changes the outcomes. And the outcome in the case of the very precise and specific parameters of our existing solar system is life. And then out of that life, I mean, yeah, we might discover that life is prolific throughout the universe. It probably is. But how much are we going to find beyond microbial life? You know, that's the question.
Right.
That's the question. And it brings us up to the threshold of something that I think is very important going on right now, the UAP phenomena, which we're not going to get into tonight, but we can talk about that. We can have that conversation soon.
And there's been some exciting developments over that over the past few days, so I think it's one that we should have sooner rather than later.
I agree.
I find it interesting.
I agree. Should we spend 5 more minutes wrapping up and make me circle back to the Leonids?
Yep, let's do it.
Okay, so here's a quote. This is from a book, 349 pages. I have it. It's a very interesting read. It's called The Heavens on Fire, The Great Leonid Meteor Storms. So I think before we leave the subject of the Leonids, we should just introduce this idea that there have been meteor storms in the past associated with the Leonids. So here is a quote from this book. Joseph Harvey Wagner was 13 years old and living in eastern Pennsylvania when he and his family were overwhelmed by the great meteor storm of November 13th, 1833. Some people he knew, quote, hid themselves behind curtains or under the bedclothes, refusing to take a second glance, end of quote. When the meteors were at their peak, Wagner recalled, they could no more be counted than one can count the fast falling flakes of snow in a hard storm. Despite the bitter cold, he and his family could not bring themselves to go inside while any falling star could be seen, quoting, it was a sight never to be forgotten. And now I'm going to share a screen. And let's see, screen.
And it is thought that these Leonid meteor storms are occurring every 33 years.
Well, not on the scale of this particular event. Now, you see here, people are coming out of their homes, and you see they're all looking up at the sky, right? You see that? So what are they seeing? Well, this is a woodcut that is an accurate representation of what these people were seeing. I'll go to the next one. So the first image is just the bottom of this. This is what they're looking up at. There's too many meteors, hundreds of meteors simultaneously in the sky, even too many to even begin to possibly count. Then we got another woodcut here showing out at sea. Can you imagine what this would have been? I mean, I've seen some spectacular meteors, but nothing like that. Now here you can see this is like it says debris trail. So this is essentially the Leonid stream right here. You can see how it intersects the Earth right here. So this debris trail, notice the trail, not the tail, the trail from Comet 55P Temple-Tuttle. So it's going out just beyond the orbit of Jupiter and then coming back in, and it makes its perihelion passage right close to the Earth's orbit. And that's why we encounter that stream in November each year. And this is what we call the radiant. So if you go out in the sky and you look towards the heavens during the Leonid meteor stream, you're going to be looking right towards the constellation of Leo. The radiant, if you take the traditional depiction of Leo, the radiant point is almost right on his eyeball, the lion's eyeball. And you can see these are, of course, this is not an actual photograph, but it shows how if you see these meteors, they would all appear to be coming from what is radiating out from a central point. Let's see here. Yeah, so this is the fireballs of November 15th. That would have been a Leonid. So the fall of a remarkable bright daylight meteor somewhere in New England was reported. When the observer stations were plotted on a map of New England, the points were dense about Boston and thinned out from there in all directions. The object itself was described as a glowing, glaring ball of golden fire which dragged a bright tail after it. It plunged sharply downward, east to north, and many observers said that it either vanished or exploded above the horizon of eastern Massachusetts. Many, in widely separated places, were confident that they saw it drop to Earth within a few miles or a few rods. Now, this is a common perceptual mistake that people make, because they think, even like in one of the accounts here, there was a cowboy who saw a meteor flying over, and he ducked in his saddle because it looked like he thought it was going to hit him, when actually, it's many miles up in the atmosphere. So here's your orbit. You can see here's Jupiter, and you see how it comes into the inner solar system, passes the sun right there at the same distance as 1 astronomical unit, then goes out just outside the orbit of Jupiter, and then comes back in. So that's Temple Tuttle. So that's the comet, but that's generally also very close to being the stream itself. There's a picture of Temple Tuttle taken by NASA. Let's see if we got anything else here. Somewhere, let's see. I've got some. Let's see. Did I just stop share?
You did, yeah.
Okay. That's what I intended to do. Okay, here we go. This is, let's go back to this. Let's see, which meteor is this? Here we go. Okay, so here's this time-lapse photograph was taken during the Leonid meteor shower of 2001. So this is an actual photograph.
Wow. That's beautiful.
Yeah. And here is the traditional outline of Leo. And look you can see if you trace these lines back, they all converge on the radiant, which is right in here. And this is interesting because this is one of the grand Leonid fireballs. And let's see, it also has its own meteor with it, which I believe, is this right here. You can see the trail of the meteor that's accompanying this fireball. I don't remember the year of this, but can you imagine seeing hundreds of things like this in the sky at once?
Yeah.
This could be as well.
Wow. In 2018, I was driving home on the highway in Raleigh, North Carolina. And I looked up from up the window, and there was what I described as a massive fireball flying across the sky. And it was there. It wasn't, it was there for 20, 30 seconds, maybe longer than that.
Oh,
and I remember,
wow. Do you remember the time of year?
It probably would have been around, probably would have been during the summertime. Maybe, maybe it was around November. I don't know. It's hard to tell.
November, it could have been the Torrids. It could have been the Leonids. Summertime could have been the Perseids. Sometimes there's some really spectacular fireballs associated with the Perseids.
Could have been that, but I looked it up. I Googled away, and I never found anything about it online. I was like, did people not just see what I saw?
Right. Yeah, here's a list of selected meteor streams with data and their associated their cometary source. Perseids was Swift Tuttle. Torrids, they say comet source Enki, but that's not exactly right, because Enki was probably a secondary or even tertiary byproduct of the disintegration of the original giant comet. But yeah, there you see the Leonids, Temple Tuttle, November 17th, radiant in Leo. And let's see, was this wasn't necessarily a Leonid, but it's interesting. Sometime during the fall of 1860, an unusual atmospheric phenomena occurred in the region. A bright light shot across the heavens, followed by a loud report, creating great alarm among the people, many of whom supposed the end of the world had arrived. Now, one of the episodes that I'm working on for Squaring the Circle is taking a very deep dive into the source and origins of our apocalyptic traditions. And so I'm pulling together a lot of quotes and things from the apocalyptic literature, both that we find in the Bible, but also in other sources as well, and showing how the striking parallels and correlations between the prophetic accounts of from the apocalyptic literature and the actual eyewitness accounts of things like Tunguska and fireball phenomena and all of that. So it's very interesting stuff.
Yeah, we live in a very active universe.
Yes, we do. We do. And its activity is not apparently uniform, but it's periodic. So that's the thing, and interestingly, some researchers in this realm have proposed that, well, we built civilizations in the space between the great catastrophes. And then when the catastrophes come, they wipe out civilizations.
Yeah.
If the civilizations are not prepared or ready to adapt to the consequences. So I think in a final concluding statement is that I think we are literally on the verge of blowing the gates open and taking a deep reevaluation of our own past on this planet, looking at the inherited legacy, the deep legacy that we've inherited from all these traditions from around the world, would all, in my mind, tend to complement and reinforce each other, and are also complemented and reinforced by the findings of modern science. The second thing is that knowledge of what's come before us is going to considerably enhance our ability to move forward into the kind of a future that is beckoning to us that we can even hardly even begin to even imagine yet at this point. The majesty and glory that could be in front of us if we just pull our shit together, and stop being distracted by the trivial stuff. Break free from this realm of superficiality and take the big picture in, because that's what's going to increase our probabilities of surviving successfully as not only as a species, but as a civilization. I mean, we could survive as a species, but our civilization goes extinct. And I think this has happened before.
We stand at a time where we have an exciting future ahead of us. Randall, this has been a fun way to celebrate the peak of the Leonid meteor shower, us going through it. So awesome. Thank you. Looking forward to doing more.
We will. My pleasure. And Becket, we've had some good conversations up to this point, and I think we're going to have some more good conversations.
I think so. Hopefully we can help people see the big picture.
Yep.
Have a good night, man.